Bismillah, walhamdulillah, salatu wassalamu ala rasulillah. Center for Peace and Global Studies welcomes you to its monthly online lecture series. My name is Sajjad Ahmad Siddiqui and I will be your host in today's session. Today our speaker is Dr. Ziaullah Rehmani. He is the Regional Advisor for Islamic Law and Jurisprudence, International Committee of the Red Cross. He holds a PhD, LLM, and LLB degrees from the International Islamic University, Islamabad. He has been teaching and doing research in this area for about 10 years. His areas of interest are constitutional law, administrative law, international humanitarian law, and Islamic Sharia. Dr. Ziaullah Rehmani will be speaking to us on international humanitarian law from an Islamic perspective. We shall have about 1 hour of talk, and that will be followed by a question and answer session. Dr. Ziaullah Rehmani, I welcome you to this session, and we are very thankful to you for giving us this opportunity to listen to us. For everybody who are listening, we are broadcasting this session live on our Facebook page, www.facebook.com/globalcenterpeace. The recording of this session will also be available on our YouTube channel. Without further delay, I will now invite Dr. Ziaullah Rehmani to speak to us. Please, Dr. Ziaullah Rehmani.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wassalatu wassalamu ala Rasulil Ameen wa ba'd. First of all, I'm thankful to the Center for Peace and Global Studies to give me this opportunity to be among such a learned audience today, which is an honor for me. And as I am a student of international humanitarian law and Islamic law, so I'll try to briefly talk on those two topics. Sajjad bhai, I cannot change my slides.
Just click on the screen and it should be okay.
Okay. So before going to the Islamic perspective of international humanitarian law, I would be briefly speaking about the IHL itself. Of course, both the topics are very broad topics, and it needs, days and weeks to learn even the basics of those. But today I'll try to, especially those who are not related to the legal field or who have not studied a law, to just give an idea of both the systems of law. International humanitarian law, as it is today in the modern world, its history starts in 1859, in 19th century. I mean that the conventions and the international treaties, including or consisting of those laws which are called international humanitarian law or IHL, its history, I'm talking of its history, it starts in 1859 in Switzerland, when Henry Dona, who was a Swiss merchant and who was traveling on his, trade for his trade, and he observed a battlefield in Solferino in the northern Italy, where the forces of France and Austria, they have fought a 16-hour war at that time, and there were many dead bodies lying on the field and many wounded. And France, which was very developed state at that time, it has only 3 doctors in their army, so they couldn't cope with the crisis of the dead and the wounded. Henry Duna, he stopped his caravan, and he, with the help of the local people, he buried the dead bodies, and he tried to take care of the wounded. And then he left, of course, for his job. But this event or this incident or this whatever he observed, it left a very deep mark on his mind. And when he went back to the Switzerland from his journey, he wrote a small book with the name of the Memoirs of Solferino, in which he suggested that there should be an organization which is to help those who are affected by wars, uh, not taking any side with anybody. So they should do this humanitarian work neutrally. And the second thing which he suggested was that there should be some laws and some treaties among the nations which could limit the sufferings of war, which should limit, the unnecessary sufferings of war. And then in 1864, the Swiss government, it convened an international conference. Of course, at that time, only European states, 12 states, they participated in that conference. And very soon, of course, Ottoman Empire, which was a big power at that time in Europe, it also joined that convention, and they formed the first Geneva Convention, what they call Geneva Convention, in 1864, which was only for taking care of the wounded soldiers on the field. So this was the beginning of the modern international humanitarian law. And then there is a long history. I'm not going into the details of that, but it went till 1949, when the current 4 Geneva Conventions, and then we have 2 additional protocols, they were, agreed upon by the states of the world. Of course, all the Muslim states were also part of those deliberations, where this 1949 4 Geneva Conventions were formed, and they were agreed and they were signed. Those 4 Geneva Conventions, they are for the wounded soldiers on the field, and then the wounded soldier in the sea, and then for the civilians and for the prisoners of war. So this is, in very short, the beginning of the international humanitarian law. If we try to have a definition of the IHL, so it is a set of rules that seeks for humanitarian reasons to limit the effects of armed conflict. It protects persons who are not or no longer directly or actively participating in hostilities, and also it imposes limits on the means and methods of warfare. So the basic idea of IHL is that war has limits. It's not the case that everything is fair in war, or the fighting forces are free to do anything or to inflict any harm in wars. So the basic idea was humanity. And the the purpose of IHL, or the main objective of IHL, is to protect the life, health, and human dignity of civilians and combatants no longer involved in hostilities, or who are captured or wounded or sick combatants, and to limit the rights of parties in conflict to use methods of warfare of their choice. Means that, as I told earlier, that they are not free to choose any way of inflicting harms, but there should be some rules and regulations, and those rules and regulations, they have been agreed upon by all the states of the world. So now the Geneva Conventions, which are 4 Geneva Conventions and 2 additional protocols, and there is a host of other treaties which are about the use of, or the means and methods of warfare, or the weapons which are to be used and which are prohibited. All those treaties have been agreed upon by most of the nations of most of the states of the world. So 192 states have signed the Geneva Conventions. Now, if we try to know the basic core principles, because there are so many treaties of IHL, but all those treaties are based basically on a few principles. And the core principle, the prime principle, is humanity. But then this humanity has been, there is a breakup for this humanity, that what does humanity means? So a very important principle is distinction. which means that during war, there should be the fighting forces, they should distinguish between civilians and combatants. And then the prohibition to attack those which are called hos de combat, which means a soldier who was fighting, but once he's wounded and he's not able to fight, or someone who surrenders, who is out of hostilities, so he's called hos de combat, so he's also protected during law. Of course, the adversary can make him a prisoner of war, but once he is fallen on the ground, when he is wounded to the limit that he can no more fight, then he cannot be targeted for killing. Then the prohibition to inflict unnecessary suffering. This is another rule that that basically the right to fight, our fighting, our war has been accepted by the humanitarian, and we know that since the beginning of life on this earth, there has been wars there, there has been conflict there, and there have been armed conflict there. So it has been accepted as an indispensable evil. But once there is a war, so the purpose of war is to defeat the enemy. So therefore, IHL, the principles of IHL, it means that you should try to defeat the enemy to the extent to which he can be defeated, but not to inflict unnecessary suffering on him. For example, if a person, a very simple example is that if there is one person who can be hit, who can be targeted with one bullet, for example, so you need not spray him with bullets, in a way that he would be cut into pieces, or you need not to come and mutilate his body once he's dead. Then the principle of necessity means that, of course, as I said, that this right of fighting forces has been accepted as indispensable evil, that once there is an armed conflict, so the enemy has to be defeated. So some things are necessary, which are for example, to defeat the enemy, you need to target him. So that is a military necessity. But then there is the principle of proportionality comes, which means that you should see how much power or how much firearm, for example, in today's world is needed to defeat the enemies. And all those principles are based on one principle, that is humanity, as I said. And that is, again, there are a few other things as well. For example, non-reciprocity and caution in attack and limitation. Non-reciprocity means that even if the adversary uses illegal means, so you are not allowed to use the same means, or to use the illegal means for taking revenge. So that is not allowed. Now, a question comes to mind that when we talk of law of war, or so international humanitarian law is part of the law of war. But law of war has two very basic branches. One is called, in legal language, they call it jus ad bellum, and one is called jus in bello. Jus in bellum means why to go to war, the reason for war, the question of legality or illegality of war. Who would declare war? Who is the authority to send troops to war? All those questions of why and who are discussed in jus ad bellum. Then jus in bello means how to conduct hostilities. So once there is a war, despite the question whether the war is legal or illegal, who declared it, who didn't declare it, whether it is a declared war or undeclared war, whether it is an international war or non-international war. But then once the war starts, when the hostility starts, how to conduct the hostilities. So international humanitarian law is related to jus in bello only. It talks of the way how to conduct hostilities. As we said, that it talks of the protection of certain persons and certain properties in war, and it also talks of the means and methods of war, that certain means and methods are legal and certain means and methods are illegal. But itself, it doesn't talk about the war. It is not a law which stops the war. So in today's world, if we know that in today's world, that theoretically the decision whether a war is legal or illegal it is the the Security Council of the United Nations which has to decide this. But how to conduct hostilities, this is what international humanitarian law means, and all the states of the world, they have signed Geneva Conventions and other treaties, and it is basically the responsibility of the states to ensure that once hostilities are there, they are conducting according to the rules and of the regulations of the agreed upon rules of international humanitarian law. What are the sources of IHL? The sources of IHL, the basic source of law is, if there are students of law and teachers of law, they know that the basic source of law is custom. So mostly the laws are those customs which are already recognized by the people, and in case of international law, by the nations of the world, by the states of the world, and then they are codified, and then they are agreed upon and signed by the states, so they become a treaty. But custom is the basic source. So Geneva Conventions are basically rules and its additional protocols, but they are based on the customs which were already there, but they have brought into this framework of Geneva Conventions. As we know that in the world history, there has always been some rules and regulation for war, even from the time immemorial, even in the ancient times. When we study the ancient, as we know, this law of Hammurabi and Mahabharata and even other religions books, the ancient books. So there are some rules and regulation of war. Of course, we'll be talking of Quran after a while. So we know that in Islam, 1400 years ago, there have been very beautiful rules and regulations for war. So that is the best part of it. But I'm talking that in every civilization, in every nation, in every religion, in every society, there has been some rules and regulations for war. Though sometimes they would be very efficient, sometimes they would not be very efficient, sometimes they would be lacking some necessary characteristics, but they have been there. Now, Geneva laws, these are two terminologies which are used in international humanitarian law. That Geneva laws are the agreements which have been formed in Geneva, and they are for the protection of civilian persons and hors de combat, as I explained, and civilian objects and cultural property. So certain, of course, civilian person who are not taking part in hostilities, like women, children, old people, like religious people, even in today's world, in the armies, the medical corps, the religious personnel of the armies, all those have been protected by Geneva laws, or they have been provided this protection by the Geneva laws, that they are not to be targeted. Then, as I explained, hors de combat, those who are out of hostilities, and civilian objects, of course, all those buildings and infrastructure which is civilian, which is not military, they are not to be targeted. Then cultural property means, that any cultural property where which is meant for the cultural importance of a nation or a society, like ruins of the old time, like even religious places like churches and mosques. Sometimes they are also included in cultural property. They have been protected, and there are special conventions of 1954 which protects, which have been where the states have agreed that cultural property is not to be targeted. Hague laws are those laws. There are many international treaties which have been formed in Hague, in the Netherlands, and they put restrictions on the means and methods of warfare. We know that there are many treaties like the ban on biological and chemical weapons, and there are other sorts of weapons which have been banned by the states through those treaties. Now, the main question whenever we talk about the law, so the question asked by a person is that who should enforce IHL? Who would be enforcing IHL? Of course, this is $1 million question, because enforcement of law is the most difficult question of today. So even if we come to the national laws and the domestic laws, we know that their enforcement is also not 100%. But when it comes to international law, so it becomes even more difficult. It becomes more harder, because the states of, today there is a concept that states are sovereign, and there is no body in the world which can compel the states to enforce the law. So basically, it is the duty of the states themselves to enforce IHL. And now internationally, there have been some efforts of putting in place some mechanisms where the international humanitarian law, or those who violate the international humanitarian law, they can be called to account. But of course, there is a lot of criticism on that, and we are not going into the details of that. We know that today we have International Criminal Court there, but International Criminal Court, again, it is an international body, and only those states are bound by the rules of International Criminal Court who are party to that agreement. And we know that there are many, many powerful states in the world who do not sign such treaties because they don't want to become, they don't want their people to be called to account, on the basis of violation of international law. So basically, the enforcement of IHL is the duty of the parties to the IHL treaties, and the parties to the IHL treaties are states. Now, this was a brief introduction to international humanitarian law. We can, of course, when we do the courses on international humanitarian law, so we do 3 days, 5-day courses, and there are, many themes which are discussed. But for today's purpose, I think this was enough to give an idea of what does IHL means. Now we come to the Islamic humanitarian law, which is a name, which a sort of a created name. I mean, in Islam, the rules and regulations relating to war or to the conduct of hostilities are discussed in what we call ilm siyar. Now, sir is an Arabic word, we know, and it is basically the plural of sira. Sira is sirat, we know the meaning of that, which means the conduct. Basically, it means the life of the Prophet in Islamic terminology. But then sir, it became, with the passage of time, in the tradition of the Muslim jurisprudence, it became the conduct of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam when he dealt with the matters of war and peace against his opponents in his time. And of course, then the rightly guided caliphs, the Khulafa Rashidin, they did the same. So seer is a very, very broad field, and it encompasses, all the matters which, are where the Muslim state has to deal with the other states, with the other people, with the foreigners during time of peace and war. And, today, as we know that we have two types of international law. We say that there is a public international law and there is a private international law. So all those types of the matters which are discussed in public international law and private international law, and all those matters, they are to be found in SIR. If we try to see, similar matters discussed by the Muslim jurisprudence or the Muslim jurists, so we would find them in the books of SIR. Now, when we study the ilm sir, so basically in the very beginning, it was called, Kitabul Jihad or Babul Jihad. So all those matters were, the matters of sir in the beginning, they were, if we go to the books of hadith, so we find those matters in the Abwabul Jihad. Now, jihad means today, in today's world, of course, jihad has been defamed a lot, and the word jihad, it has been given a certain meanings by many, by some but some people who have their own agenda, and some people who because of their misdeeds, they have given this meaning to jihad. But it means, in Islamic terminology, it means a struggle for a great and noble cause. وَجَاهِدُوا فِي اللَّهِ حَقَّ جِهَادِهِ, as this is a command of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to every Muslim, that he should do the jihad. It includes all efforts, of course, made for such a noble cause. Of course, from preaching to writing to defending it verbally, making strategies for, the promotion of these noble causes, and as sometime, of course, as a last resort, to take part in actual combat is also called jihad. where of course the word qital is also used. But of course we know the students of Islam, they know that it is not only limited to fighting as some would misunderstand today. Now, the definition of jihad, just for those who are new to this field, Ibn Taymiyyah is a very famous Muslim jurist of 14th century. He defines jihad in a very beautiful way. He said that it is either performed by heart. So it starts from the heart, and when you intend to do some good thing, or when you intend to do to offer a sacrifice, or through preaching and calling toward the religion of Islam, are making truth clear to the wrongdoers and answering their objections and questions, are planning and devising means for the benefits of Islam or Muslims, and by taking part in actual combat. So, as we have this very famous and very beautiful hadith of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, that kullukum ra'in wa kullukum mas'ulun an ra'iyatihi, that every one of you is a sort of supervisor, and he would be asked about his or her subordinates. So everyone is actually bound to do this jihad according to his own capacity. It's not only fighting. Fighting is of course one of the important part of jihad, and sometimes it is necessary. This is something that you have to defend, your deen, your land, your honor, and so you have to fight. But of course jihad is very broad, and we, as we explained, that it has all those meanings. So it's obligatory on different person in different ways and according with their own capacity and capability. So the word jihad, the word qital, kitabul qital and kitabul jihad, all those are the books where we find the details of the seer, ilm seer, and where both the reasons for war, that which we call illatul qital and which we call adabul qital. As I said, jus et bellum is why to go to war. This why to go to war is in Islamic jurisprudence called illatul qital, the reason for war, whether a war is legal or not, who would declare the war, when to go to war. So all those questions are discussed under the illatul qital. And then we have adabul qital, that is jus and bello in today's IHL terminology. The Muslim jurisprudence, they have been discussing this jus and bello or adabul qital in a very great detail. It seems that they have been focusing more on adabul qital when it comes to the kutubul jihad and kutubul maghazi and kutubul kutubul sir, because in the especially in the early Islamic history, the responsibility of the illatul qital, or declaring the war or when to go to war, it was the prerogative of the Muslim ruler, while the Muslim jurists were concerned that those Muslim mujahids or soldiers who go for jihad, they should know what are the adab al-qital. So they try to explain that in greater details. Now, what are the sources of this Islamic IHL? The sources of Islamic IHL are, of course, it is part of Islamic law. So we know that the sources of Islamic law are Quran and Sunnah. Someone is raising his hand. Should I stop and listen to what Nawab Zada wants to say?
No, I think you should continue. We'll have a
Okay,
question and answer session at the end.
no problem. So the main sources are two, which is Quran and Sunnah, and which is basically the Wahi. And we know that Quran is called Wahi Jali, and Sunnah is called Wahi Khafi. Sunnah is also based on Wahi, but Quran is a direct form of Wahi, while Sunnah is something which was put in the heart of the Prophet ﷺ, and sometimes he gave his own words, or he demonstrated it through his deeds. So it is the practice of Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. In Islam, of course, we know that all laws are derived from those two sources. There are other secondary sources where the Muslim jurists, they rely upon when they try to legislate laws. And as we know that Islam is not time bound, not region bound, and it is a universal deen. So there has been given certain tools and principles which can be used by any people, by any society in any time to infer rules for any upcoming issues, for any new issues which have not been clearly mentioned in Quran and Sunnah. So these are sometimes called sources, but basically these are tools of the legislation. Like we know that qiyas is there, and then very broadly speaking, ijtihad is there, and there are many details of that. So the basic source of Islamic humanitarian law are what we can say as Islamic IHL is the Quran and Sunnah, and the secondary sources are the practice of the Prophet ﷺ and the practice of the companions. But then when the Muslim jurists, when they discuss the adab al-qital, so they refer to the practice of the Prophet ﷺ in the first place. Then Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu, who basically dealt with the apostates, murtaddeen, in his 2 years period. So that is another prime source of the rules. And then Umar radiallahu anhu, who dealt with mainly with the Ahli Kitab, the Jews and the Christians during his time. And then Usman radiallahu anhu also dealt, on international borders. And then Ali radiallahu anhu, we know that during Ali radiallahu anhu's 5 years times, there was an internal armed conflict of, within the Muslim state. So that internal armed conflict has some special rules. Therefore, the Muslim jurists refer to the practice of Ali radiallahu anhu when it comes to the internal or the non-international armed conflict, as it is called today in IHL. Just an interesting point is that in today's IHL, when it started among the states. And we know that it started in Europe. And even the international law itself, the broader international law started in Europe. And in the beginning, the European states, they agreed that it would only be for Europeans. Maybe they don't use the word European. They said that it would be for the civilized nations. And by civilized nations, they meant the European nations. Then it was the first non-European or semi-European nation which participated in the international treaties was the Ottoman Caliphate at their time, and then of course Iran at their time. But in the beginning, they were talking of the states, and of late they have not been considering on the international level the non-international armed conflict, which means that when a group of people within a state take arms against the state government for any reason, and we know that there are many examples in the world for this phenomenon. So of course that is also a war, and IHL is very much concerned. It should be very much concerned whenever it is a war, whether it is international or non-international. But the states were not ready to include the non-state armed actors, in the fold of IHL. But then, of course, with the additional protocol and with the efforts of some particular states, now they have been recognized, and there are rules which cover the non-international armed conflict as well. But in Islamic law, from the very beginning, as I mentioned, during Ali radiallahu anhu's time, there was an protracted international armed conflict, and there have been many rules devised by Ali radiallahu anhu, because as he was fighting against Khawarij, and he never termed, Ali radiallahu anhu never declared Khawarij as non-Muslims, as infidels, though the Khawarij, nauzubillah, they thought, or they said that Ali radiallahu anhu is not a Muslim, and therefore they was fighting against him. But Ali radiallahu anhu never declared them as infidels, and so there were particular rules for when it came to fighting with them. There were particular adab al-qital, and therefore the Muslim jurists, they refer to the Ali radiallahu anhu's conduct in that regard. Now, another very important source, and sometimes we overlook it today, is the treaties. You know that in Islam, there is a very big significance of the treaties. We know that the Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu awfu bil uqud, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that, oh believers, you fulfill your covenant. And then there are many other ayat and ahadith which shed light on the importance of ahad and pact and agreement and treaties. And the Prophet ﷺ said, Al-Muslimuna inda shurutihim. The Muslims are bound by their stipulations. Illa shartan ahalla haraman aw harrama halalan. Except for any stipulation which makes something haram as halal or something haram as halal. Means that something, a stipulation can be invalid, but if the treaty is generally valid and if the treaty is in the limits of permissible things, then the Muslims are bound by that. They are bound by that as if they are bound by any rule in Quran and Sunnah. So treaty is a very important source of law. And then, of course, the in Islam, it has been practiced by the Prophet ﷺ. It has been told to us by the Prophet ﷺ through his deeds that treaty is to be followed with letter and spirit. It's not the case that you apparently agree on something with another state, with another nation, and then you do something underground, against the treaty. So a very prime example, we know that during the an early battle of Islam, Huzaifa bin al-Yaman and his father, when they were going towards the Muslims to join them for fighting against the Mushrikeen, so the Mushrikeen, they arrested them, they captured them, and then they released them on a sort of a parole. They said that we would release you only on one condition, that you will not fight against us. And they said, okay, we agree on that. And they were released and they went to the Prophet ﷺ and they told the whole story to the Prophet ﷺ. And they said, but now we have come, so we will be joining you in fighting. And the Prophet ﷺ said, no, because you have given this ahad to them, so nafi bi'ahdina, the Prophet ﷺ said that we will fulfill our agreement, we will fulfill our promise, and we will pray to Allah to help us against them. So even that, and we know the very famous event of Sulh Hudaybiyah, when Abu Jandal, one of the captive, when he came after the Hudaybiyah pact has been signed, and when he came, so the Prophet ﷺ returned him to the Mushrikeen, because the Prophet ﷺ has agreed in the Sulh Hudaybiyah, in the Hudaybiyah agreement, that anyone who would run from the Mushrikeen to the Muslim, they would be returned. And the Muslim were apparently they were very angry to to agree on that. But the Prophet ﷺ, he knew the wisdom of that, and we know that the wisdom was that those persons from Makkah who ran away and who, according to the agreement, they could not go to Medina because it was stipulated in the agreement of Sulh Hudaybiyah. So they made a front, outside Medina, and they would take, the caravans coming of the Mushrikeen, and this became a trouble for the Mushrikeen themselves. So I mean, there are many examples. If we keep on mentioning them, we just one more example, that Muawiyah radhiyallahu anhu, who was the ruler of Sham, who was the governor of what is called Bilad al-Sham. And Sham means, as we know that today Sham means Syria, but in the Islamic history, Bilad al-Sham means today's Syria, Lebanon, Israel, Palestine, Jordan, all this area was called Bilad al-Sham. So this was a province of the Islamic State during Umar radhiyallahu anhu's time, and during the Khilafat Rashida, and Muawiyah radhiyallahu anhu was ruling this part of the Islamic State, and he had an agreement with the neighboring Roman Empire. He had ceasefire till a particular date, and when the date was coming near, the Muawiyah radhiyallahu anhu, he ordered his troops to redeploy towards the boundary, toward the borders, so that when the truce comes to an end, he would attack at once. And when he ordered that, Amr ibn Ambasa, who was a companion of the Prophet ﷺ, he said the famous word, he said, "Wafa'un la ghadar, wafa'un la ghadar." He said that we should fulfill the agreement. So until the date of the ceasefire comes to an end, we cannot redeploy the troops, because that would be ghadar, and ghadar is called treachery. Ghadar means that when you when you do something against the agreement, and ghadar has a particular meaning. There is One word is khid'a, as the Prophet ﷺ said, al-harbu khid'a, that war is a deception. So that is the military deception, and that is called the ruses of war. That is allowed even in today's international law. That is allowed. But ghadar, which is in today's international law called perfidy, that is not allowed. That means that when you do something where the enemy, the adversary trusts you, and then you breach the trust in a way, like the example would be to raise a white flag and going towards the enemy, which means surrender, and which is an international norm, since ancient times, that when you have this white flag or white cloth, and you raise your hand and you go towards the adversary, it means that you are surrendering or you are going to talk to them. And then when you go near to them, you start firing on them. This would be called treachery or other. So Muawiyah radiallahu anhu, when Amr ibn Ambasa told him that not to do that, so he accepted what Amr ibn Ambasa said, and he said, okay, we'll stop and we'll only redeploy the troops when the date comes. So this is the importance of treaties, which have not only been mentioned in Quran and Sunnah, but which has been practiced by the Muslims throughout the history. And of course, in today's international law, it is also a norm that treaty should be, those who are part of the treaty, they should be bound by that. Now, if we very briefly, again, there are many details, but if very briefly go to the a few rules of the Islamic humanitarian law, or the jus and bello, or the what we can call Islamic IHL. So the verse 190 of Surah Al-Baqarah is, this is the essence of IHL. When we go to the tafasir, the Muslim exegesis, so we know that they have been discussing this verse of Quran in a way that all important principles of the basic important principles of IHL today, they come into this verse. It says, A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim, وَقَاتِلُوا فِي سَبِيلِ اللَّهِ الَّذِينَ يُقَاتِلُونَكُمْ وَلَا تَعْتَدُوا إِنَّ اللَّهَ لَا يُحِبُّ الْمُعْتَدِينَ. Which means fight in the way of God against those who fight you, and don't transgress, for God does not love transgressors. So this verse of Quran, as I told you, that it includes all those principles like humanity, proportionality, which we discussed very briefly, and distinction, and even military necessity. So it says, وَقَاتِلُوا فِي سَبِيلِ اللَّهِ. It says you should fight in the way of Allah. So fighting is not prohibited, but it should be in the way of Allah. So this way of Allah is the first qualification of fighting. It should not be for something worldly or for something, for some ulterior motives, but it should be in the way of Allah, which should be a noble cause, of course. And then against those who fight you, it means that don't fight against those who do not fight against you. So and there are many hadiths of the Prophet ﷺ. We know that the Prophet would send the Sahaba to some place, and then he would say that don't begin, with the fighting. First invite them to Islam, then try to have a sulh with them, then try to have some agreement. But if they don't do, and if you are compelled, only then you should fight. It means that this verse says that those who do not, or who don't intend to fight against you, you should not fight against them. And then again, the Mufassirin, they have said that all the non-combatants, all the civilians, those who are no longer taking part in hostilities, the elderly, the children, the women, the farmers, the servants, all are protected by law and cannot be targeted in accordance with this verse. And it's not only this verse, but there are many ahadiths of the Prophet ﷺ. When he would send his Sahaba to jihad, he would tell them very expressly not to target, these civilians, not to target, not to destroy any infrastructure without any necessity, not to destroy any agricultural crops. Of course, all those instructions have been given by the Prophet ﷺ, and this verse is, of course, as I told, the essence of those details which have been practiced by the Prophet and the Sahaba Ridwanullahi alayhim ajmain. And even today, the international humanitarian law talks about the protection of medical mission, for example, etc. And it says that all those non-military staff, which is part of an army, like the cooking staff, like the servants, like the medical doctors, like the religious personnel. They are not to be targeted. They are not considered as combatants. So we know that even in hadith, the Muslim jurists, they infer from the hadith this, that all those categories have been included in certain words in hadith. For example, the Prophet ﷺ once sent a message to Khalid bin Walid, and it says, "La taqtulu dhurriyatan wala asifa," that don't kill children and asif. So the Muslim fuqaha, when they explain the asif, they say that asif means the servants, and then servants means, all types of servants who are basically not there for fighting, but they are for serving, those who are coming to fighting. And as we know that in the early Islamic times, when the Muslim troops, when they would go out for jihad, the women will also accompany them, but the women would not fight against the enemy actively. Of course, they would just play the role of the medics, or they would serve their men on the battlefield. So that also, and then we know that when at that time there was a rule of the what we call the bounty of war. So when the bounty of war was divided, the women were not given a share like those who were taking active part. It means that they were not considered as combatant by the Prophet ﷺ and the Sahaba Ridwanullahi alayhim ajmain as well. Now, in IHL, there are certain categories in today's IHL. There are certain categories of protected person and objects, but we know that all those categories are included, as I said, in the in the instructions given by the Prophet ﷺ and by Hazrat Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu and by other Khulafa Rashidin, and the Muslims, they have been practicing it throughout the Muslim history. Now, here is what we call the 10 commandments of Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu. So these are the instructions which were based on the instructions given by the Prophet ﷺ during different battles and different times, when he instructed or when he directed his companions when they would go to war. So Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu, he should don't embezzle. Of course, embezzle at that time there was a norm of collecting the bounty, and don't cheat, as we talked of the ghadar. Of course, don't break a pledge. This is very important, that when you give a pledge to someone, and according to Islamic law, even one soldier of the Muslim army, he can give shelter to an enemy soldier, or soldiers for that matter. And once he has given that shelter, or that asylum, or that protection, then the whole army, the Muslim army, is responsible for this. We are talking of the strict of the strict Muslim jurisprudence in the classical time. Today, of course, all the Muslim armies, they have their own rules, and they are bound by the international treaties. And as we said, they would practice those. But when we, for the sake of knowledge, when we study and when we learn how the matter has been dealt with throughout the Islamic history, so this is the case. So there is a hadith also in this regard, that even if one Muslim, if he gives a dhimma, or a shelter to someone, so all the Muslimin, they would be responsible for that. Don't mutilate. Of course, in today's world, it would sound very strange that someone would be mutilating a body, even though even in the modern times it happened. The mutilation means making parts of the dead body, cutting a dead body into parts, which is called in Islamic terminology muthla. But the Prophet ﷺ, from the very beginning, at a time when mutilation was a norm in battles, and the enemies, they would mutilate the bodies of the conquered troops. And we know that in the Battle of Uhud, this famous mutilation occurred when the uncle of the Prophet ﷺ, Hamza radiallahu anhu, whose dead body was mutilated. And this was a time when even the Prophet ﷺ was so angry that he said that we would take revenge of this, and we'll do. But then, of course, Quran revealed, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sort of prohibited the Prophet not to do what the enemies would do. And then don't kill a child or an old woman or man. This is very, very obvious. Don't cut down a date palm, and don't burn it either. Today, of course, international law and the international community is very concerned with the protection of natural environment, and now there is an international debate going on the protection of natural environment, and this climate change is occurring because of the damage to the natural environment, and during wars and armed conflict, the biggest damage occurred to the natural environments. So you know that the Prophet ﷺ, Islam from the very beginning prohibited this. Don't cut down a fruit tree, or don't slaughter a goat or a cow or camel except for food. Here, we discussed the concept of military necessity. So it means that when there is a military necessity, you can do anything, not anything but the necessary thing, but without the military necessity, don't do that. Never destroy any building. This is what is called in today's laws called wanton destruction, or destruction without any necessity or without any reason. And then you may pass near people who have secluded themselves in convents. Leave them in their seclusion. The Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu here talks about the monasteries where the monks or the religious people would just sitting there, and they don't have anything with the fighting, so they were also given this protection. Now, the last part of my this presentation, and I am actually running through it because if you go into the details of every point, so it would take a lot of time, and then, but I would leave the rest of the time for discussion or any comments. So, with some general principles of the international Islamic humanitarian law, as discussed by the Muslim jurists, is what concept is individual criminal responsibility. This is a very strong concept in generally in Islam. Of course, kullu nafsim bima kasabat rahina, as we know, that everyone is bound, or everyone would be called to account for his deeds. La tazru waziratun wizra ukhra. No one would shoulder the burden of another. So everyone, for example, during fighting, if a soldier does a wrong thing or a violation of the law, so he cannot take excuse that I was commanded by my commander. So whenever the commander commands, of course, if it is wrong, he is not bound to obey his commanders. So the obedience is, of course, limited. As we know, the Prophet ﷺ has very clearly said, La ta'ata li makhluqin fi ma'asiyatillahi azza wa jal, that there is no obedience of the creature of any persons when it amounts to the disobedience of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Then reciprocity is another concept. Sometimes it is misunderstood, and sometimes some people would take shelter in this concept for their misdeeds or for whatever they do as violation of the rules. They would say that because the enemy is doing or the adversary is doing this to us, so we would be doing this. Of course, this is not allowed in Islam. Islam, when Islam says, and there are some ayat in Quran, sometimes they are misinterpreted. For example, that you should punish as you have been punished. But when you go to the tafsir of those ayat, so the ulama say that it means, of course, you can punish the one who has punished you or who has inflicted some harm on you in due course of law. Of course, it is not a free thing that you can do anything, or you can take revenge on your sweet will in a way which you choose for yourself. So reciprocity is is a concept that it is there in some matters. For example, in the matters of diplomacy or the international relation, reciprocity is there. As there is a text from a book of fiqh which says al-amru baynana wa baynahum mabniyun al-mujaza, that the affairs between us and them are based on reciprocity. But their reciprocity means the diplomatic relation or the trade relations or the international relations. But when it comes to the violations of law, for example, the violation of rules, are doing illegal things against someone has done an illegal thing against the Muslim state, so the Muslim state cannot do that illegal thing. And there are a lot of examples from the Islamic history. We know that necessity is another concept which is misunderstood and sometimes which is abused or misused by some people. Necessity means darura, which is in Islamic concept is called darura. So there is a very famous verse in Quran which says, "A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim, faman ittarra ghayra baghin wala 'adin fala ithma alayh." That whoever is compelled without any intention of transgression or without any intention of violation, so there is no problem if he does something wrong or something which is prohibited. Of course, this is in a particular situation and in a particular limits. Therefore, the Muslim fuqaha, the Muslim jurists, they said, for example, there is one rule which says ad-daruratu tubihu al-mahzurat, that necessity makes unlawful things as lawful. But then another qualifying rule is that ad-daruratu tuqaddaru biqadariha, that necessity is to be kept in its limits. Means that necessity is not something free that you just say that now it is the condition of necessity and then you would be free to do anything. So a very simple example of necessity, which is not, of course, we are talking of war matters, but from the general life, the necessity is that if someone is detained in a room, for example, and he is dying of thirst, for example, there are no water in that room, there is a bottle of wine, for example, so he's allowed to take a few sips of wine so that he saves his life, but he's not allowed to enjoy the whole bottle of wine, for example, because it is necessary. No, the necessity is only to wet his throat so that his life is saved. Therefore, and there can be many other examples of necessity, but in the benefit of time, I won't go there. Then perfidy in Islamic law, I already mentioned that, which is called ghadar. It is strictly prohibited in Islamic law. And in the classical Islamic law books, when we go there, so we find that the Muslim jurists, they have been talking of perfidy, particularly in the matters of ambassadors and traders. When because you know that the ambassadors, they have been given this protection from the time immemorial. We know that when two messengers of the Musaylama, the impostor prophet, the one who claimed prophethood at the during the time of the Prophet ﷺ, Musaylama, who is called Musaylama Kazzab, the liar. So when he sent two messengers to the Prophet ﷺ, and they talked to the Prophet ﷺ, and the Prophet ﷺ was very angry, and he said that if it was not illegal to kill the messengers, I would have killed you. So here the Prophet ﷺ was telling that killing of messenger is not allowed. Likewise, the traders, they are not allowed to be killed because they are given this protection when they go to the enemy state. So if the ambassador or the traders, if they are there, so the Muslim jurists say that they should never take part in hostilities, because it would be it would amount to perfidy or ghadar, because they have been given this protection. And if they do that, so it means that they are damaging their protection and their trust, and then no one would accept any ambassador, any traders in their state. So therefore, that is very strictly prohibited. These were some basic ideas or basic points about the international humanitarian law and its Islamic perspective. And now I would be very happy to discuss any questions. If I can answer them, you are welcome to do that. Thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
Wa alaikum assalam. Jazakumullah khair, Dr. Ziaullah Rehmani. Thank you very much for a very informative session. If anyone has any questions, they can raise their hands, or they can write their questions in the chat window, and I will read them out. Okay, in the meantime, yeah, Dr. Abdullah Hafiz, could you please unmute yourself? Yes, Dr.
Assalamu
Abdullah.
alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah.
I'm Dr. Abdul Hafiz from Islamic University in Uganda. I want to take this opportunity to thank the professor for the wonderful presentation he has made. I have a simple question that I would like the professor to throw some light on, and that is on the two areas of the law of war, the Jews in Bello and the Jews at Belam. As he rightly stated, the international humanitarian law is more concerned with the Jews in Bello. That is the conduct of the war. Don't you think, Professor, that ignoring the discussion and deliberation on the Jews at Belam is one way or another, it has contributed to the breach of the conduct of war? Because if we are not concerned about the reasons, the justification for the war and so on, and our concentration is only on the conduct of war, don't you think that in one way or another it is contributing to the breach of the conduct of the war? Thank you very much.
Should I answer, Sajjad bhai?
Yes, please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Dr. Abdul Hafiz. Very happy to have you from Uganda. Thank you for this question. This is a very important question. That's true that if the Jews at Belam are the reasons for war are ignored, so it would contribute to something bad, as you mentioned. But you know that I'm not sure what do you mean that we today we are talking of IHL, and IHL is a particular area of law. So therefore we cannot talk of everything in one session. So therefore we have talked only about IHL. If you talk of the institutions who are taking care of these two main dimensions of the international humanity in the law of war, so of course you know that in this world everyone can do something, but everyone cannot do everything. So every institution has its own mandate and its own area of work, and every institution cannot do all the work. So therefore there is a division of this, as I alluded to in the very beginning, that theoretically, basically, it is the responsibility of the United Nations Security Council to do that. Now, as ICRC, I'm not in position to discuss that, you know, to what extent, you know, that is being done in what way. You are learned people, you know that. But you know, the ICRC is concerned with the international humanitarian law. Again, it's basically the responsibility of states, because those conventions, those international treaties have been agreed upon by the states. So it is their responsibility to enforce them, and ICRC is only playing a role of sort of encouraging the states, promoting this law, as it has been given the responsibility of the international humanitarian laws promotion, and sometime, of course, lobbying for it to have, you know, certain conventions. But basically, it is the states who are all powerful, who have the power of enforcement. Enforcement cannot be done without power, without authority, and the authority rests with the states. So I agree with you that if it is ignored, the first part, then it would cause problem to the second part. But basically, different institutions have different responsibilities, and they should fulfill that. I'm not sure if I have answered your question, Dr. Abdul Hafiz.
Okay, Hassan Al Hussein, could you please unmute yourself.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Alaikum salam wa rahmatullah.
Assalamu alaikum wa Professor, my first, I take this opportunity to thank you for the presentations that you have done. It's really so benefiting. And my kind request is it as the content which you have been sharing through the platform, because some of us, we are not having the access to get it.
I'm afraid I couldn't get you, Brother Hassan.
Do you just want the slides?
If you want the slides, yes, I will give it to Brother Sajjad and he can make it available to you. No problem.
Okay,
Yes.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Okay, there are a couple of questions in the chat. One from Waqar Ahmed. What is the reference of Sahaba practices like 10 commands of Abu Bakr? Where can we find them?
You can find them in many books. At the moment, I remember that there is a very famous book, Futuh al-Buldan. Futuh al-Buldan. It is a book by Baladuri. I don't remember his full name, but the famous name is Baladuri. So it's there. But if you go to the books of Hadith and the books of history, like Al-Bidayah wa Nihaya and like the Hayat al-Sahaba books, so all these things can be found there.
Okay. Another question from Dr. Farhana Mahmood. Please
Yes.
guide us about the significance of peace treaties, negotiation, and international diplomacy. Like international laws talk about peace between states through diplomacy to save humanity from war disaster such as in Ukraine and Palestine and other states.
I'm sorry. Is this question written there?
Yes, it's
Where
just
is it?
directed to me, not to everyone.
Can you
Guide
repeat
us
it?
about significance of peace treaties, negotiation, and international diplomacy.
Yes.
International laws talk about peace between states through diplomacy to save humanity from war disasters such as in Ukraine and Palestine and other areas.
Yeah. I don't know. I'm qualified to answer this question, but I mean, this is very obvious that if you go to the seerah of the Prophet ﷺ, we know that when the Prophet ﷺ came to Medina after migration, so he started, the first thing which he did was that he did an internal treaty with the powerful economic community of Medina, that was Yahud, and with the power political community of Medina, which were Aus and Khazraj. So they had this Misaq-e Medina. And if you study the biography of the Prophet ﷺ, so then he gradually started, like, he made the Medina is the state of Medina as the center, and then he gradually started going around that state and went to the nearer one tribe, and the first thing he would try to have a pact with them, to have a peaceful coexistence treaty with them. So the whole life of the Prophet is telling us that the effort and the struggle for the peaceful coexistence. But when it was not possible, so then only, or if there would be, for example, we know that in Medina, the Prophet ﷺ did this treaty with the Misaq-e Medina, and the Jews were part. There were 3 tribes of the Jews. They were part of that treaty. And then the Prophet ﷺ never touched them unless they went against their treaty one by one, and they did things which were not, possible to be forgiven. So only then the Prophet ﷺ punished them. And same is the case with the other tribes, So the Prophet ﷺ went on, and with all the tribes, he tried to have a treaty. So I think that there is the peace treaty with other states or within the states cannot be overemphasized, and Islam is totally, it has recommended that.
Okay, Salim Hashmi, do you want to ask a question? Because you raised your hand in the past.
Assalamu alaikum warahmatullah.
Wa alaikum salam.
Jazakallah khair, Dr. Mashallah. The clarity of your thought process and delivery was brilliant. Inshallah, I'm looking forward to have your presentation. My name is Muhammad Anwar Salim Hashmi. I'm a student of peace and conflict. And in very short, one of my biggest concern is the misunderstanding of the Muslims' narrative at the strategic level. We always talk about, love and hate towards different nations. And the Rahmatul Alameen brought this very concept of coexistence, where the Qul Ya Ayyuhal Kafirun is the very narrative of Muslims. I believe that this is where we have failed to send the message to the rest of the world that Muslims are for Rahmah. And my question was that, how do you think that this narrative, which is a very simple narrative, where Quran clearly talks about not abusing the gods of the others, where they might come back and say bad things to you, and having bad guman towards your own kind or others. So what do you think, first of all, do you agree with my submission? And do you think that if we emphasize on this very idea of we being the parallels is going to make the world much more safer place in the years to come? And a humble request, if I can get your WhatsApp number, that would be of a great favor. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, brother Salim Hashmi, for your encouraging words. And please, Sajad bhai, you can give my WhatsApp number to him, no problem. Well, again, I think it's not my position to comment on such thing, but generally I agree with you. Of course, we have not been very much successful to send this genuine and original and real message of our deen to the world. But it's not the only reason. There are many other reasons, internal and external, and I'm sorry I cannot discuss it at this point of time for some reasons, but there are many reasons which has blurred this whole picture of the Deen Islam, and this trial is going on. But every one of us at our own level should try to strive for this narrative to be promoted. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We are still waiting for questions. I had one question in mind. In the recent times, there was some controversy in Afghanistan and Syria, where the statues of Buddhas and other heritage of the past were destroyed, and the narrative that was used was that this is from the time of ignorance, and these memories should be wiped away. What is the position of Islam on these topics?
Well, I think that the position of Islam is that I would just tell you something, and then you can think of the position of Islam. I tell you, and we all know this, the Sahaba, they conquered Egypt, right? And they conquered Syria. And during the Sahaba, Afghanistan was, during Usman radiallahu anhu's time, according to the history, the Muslim army, they have reached to Afghanistan. But if not during the Usman radiallahu anhu time, after that, they reached there. For the past over 1,000 years, all those ruins, those statues, they were there. No one touched them. Why? Because basically, they were only a sign of the past, and they were not something which was worshipped by someone. In Afghanistan, those statues, they were not worshipped by anyone, but they were a sign of the past. So, to my humble understanding, and this is my very, very personal opinion of mine, that when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in Quran says, قل سيروا في الأرض فانظروا كيف كان عاقبة الذين من قبلكم, and in that go and do a tour around the earth and see what has been done to the past nations. So I think that there are the signs of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that we see in those ruins, even if they are statues or even if they're something. So unless there is something which is in the Muslim government, under the Muslim government jurisdiction, and some paganism is being promoted there or something, then maybe the Muslim government can do a decision against it. But for me, as I understand, as a student of Islamic law, I think there is no problem in having such statues, and there is no, I don't see any reason to break them. Wallahu alam.
Jazakumullah khair. Some people had raised their hands, but then they lowered it. So I don't remember who were they. So if you want to ask a question, please keep your hand raised, so I know.
If someone has a question, just say Assalamu alaikum and begin.
Yeah, Mr. Rizq, could you please unmute yourself? Yes.
We can't hear you, Mr. Rizq.
Prof, can you hear me there?
Yes.
Yes.
Sorry.
Okay, thank you. I was saying my question is outside what we have been studying, but it has been puzzling me. The relationship between IHL and Islam and COVID-19. Can we have a linkage between COVID-19 and IHL and Islam? Thank you.
Sorry, you're not Mr. I think you're Mr. Rizq. Thank you very much for the question. I don't know in what sense you are asking this question. COVID-19 is a disease, and IHL and Islam is a law. We have been, in ICRC, we have been doing in COVID-19 here in Pakistan. When we talked of this preventive measures, so some people, when they said that no, these are only Western impositions on the Muslims. So we talked to the Islamic scholars here in Pakistan, the authentic, renowned, recognized Islamic scholars like Mufti Munibur Rahman and Mufti Rafi Usmani and others, and they helped us, and they said that no, this is, and Qari Hanif Jalandhari even, they recorded video message for us. They said that diseases from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and it is necessary that we try to prevent it, and then all the measures, basically they were sort of based on cleanliness, for example, hygiene, etc., and Islam very much recommends it. And then the example was given during the Sahaba time. I think during Umar's time there have been a pandemic, and the Sahaba, they even said that we should not, those who are there in the area of pandemic, they should not come out, and those who are outside, they should not go to the pandemic. So this concept of the lockdown, etc., even that was recommended to a certain extent. Of course, again, there are many other issues and problems there, but generally speaking, and if sincerely all those measures were taken, so Islam would recommend that. I don't know if you are asking in this sense, Otherwise, IHL has nothing to do with the COVID, of course. It's medical science which should deal with COVID.
Jazakumullah khair. Mukasa Abdullah, could you please unmute yourself? Yes.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Thank you so much for the wonderful lecture. Mine is just an observation that you've been brought in as regard to treaties. But when you look at the hikmah behind the treaties, sometimes you find that the warring parties, they are not truthful to these treaties, and that's where the problems are coming from. So for me, I think the secret behind signing these treaties is to critically look into the would-be causes of going into war. If at all they don't hold any much water, such wars should be prevented. But you find that treaties are signed and then the parties continue to fight. Then even when these treaties are signed amidst fighting, you find that there could be some requests that are supposed to be met, but the parties, they move ahead and they don't again fulfill the agreements within the treaty is signed. So we need to put in much emphasis that when Allah allows something, sometimes we should look so much to see the secrets behind, but not just doing it as a routine and we leave it like that. So when we look at the Treaty of Hudaybiyah, for example, it was signed, some clauses look to be tougher to the Muslim community, but the Prophet accepted because the essence of peace was so crucial. And you see that immediately when the Meccans did not conform to the terms of the treaty, again, Allah gave the Muslims Nasr and Mecca was conquered. So the same thing should be put into consideration. Thank you so very much for the wonderful lecture. We hope to get more other lectures, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. I'm Mukasa Abdullah from Kampala, Uganda.
Shukran jazilan, Akh Mukasa. Hayakumullah. Thank you very much. Very important point, of course, and I think no one would disagree with this, that when a treaty is, it is basically in the area of mubahat, I mean the permissible thing. And when it comes to the permissible thing, you have to decide whether this is good for you or not. So is the responsibility or the duty or the right of any state, any government, any community who is entering into the treaty, because when you enter into the treaty, you enter into it with your free consent. And the consent is given only if you think that it would be really beneficial. So I totally agree with you. If you think that the treaty is only a way of avoiding something else, then of course the leadership which is entering into a treaty, they should decide against it. But yes, and the hikmah, al-hikmatu dallatul mu'min, as Prophet ﷺ says that hikmah, the wisdom is, the last property of the believers. So they should always exercise hikmah whenever come to the affairs of this, even the personal life, but of the states more importantly. Thank you very much.
Jazakumullah khair. Dr. Jamaluddin, could you please unmute yourself? Yes, go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Am I audible?
Yes, please go ahead.
Okay. Thank you, Ziaullah Sahab, for wonderful and comprehensive presentation. I am the computer science PhD doctor, so my question is a little bit general, not specific to some humanitarian law. I was most concerned about the other international, global, and social aspects. Like if you are targeting only the Islamic perspective of humanitarian law, so how we can connect the Islamic perspective of other social and global issues, so like in sciences and in life sciences, engineering sciences, linguistics, even they are all international subjects, and the connection of these areas, social areas, and with the divine knowledge, source of knowledge, source of information. So how we can cover other aspects from Islamic perspectives?
Thank you very much, Dr. Jamaluddin. Again, the question is, maybe Islamization of knowledge or Islamization of laws, and I would not be that qualified to answer it, but because you have asked this, so just as a student, I would just express my personal thinking, which is that, when we talk of this, the natural sciences, or even the sciences like computer sciences, etc. So they are mere sciences. Personally, I don't agree that there is Islamic physics or Islamic computer science or un-Islamic computer science. It is computer science, and it is the legacy of the humanity, and all humans are equally, to be benefited from it. But as a believer, as a Muslim, when a Muslims enter into any field of knowledge or science, so he keeps in mind this ultimate, the essence of this whole thing, that all the ilm is coming from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And basically, though again, I'm not very much fond of the idea that when some people come and they say that, look, this scientific fact has been mentioned in Quran, and with this, actually, they try to prove the authenticity of Quran with the mention of the scientific, fact in the Quran. I'm totally against it, because Quran is the book of Hidayah. It is an eternal book. The facts of science keep changing. Sometimes the earth circulates, sometimes it becomes stationary, sometimes the sun circulates, and sometimes it is becomes static. So we should not do that. But again, we the basic principles of knowledge, they have been mentioned in Quran. So a believer, whenever a Muslim, whenever he studies anything, or for that matter, if he studies the natural sciences, so he would be amazed that all this system has been put in place by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, who is the ultimate creator and runner of the whole system. And this would increase his iman. As in Quran, there is a verse of Quran which says, "Innama yakhshallaha min ibadihi al-ulama," that it is the scholars who fear the most from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So sometime, generally it is understood that the ulama here means ulama Islam, that is like the ulama deen. But basically, if we interpret the word ulama, so maybe it would be more meaning the scientists, because they know the system which is being put in place by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The more, a person who is specializing in, for example, who know the system of the galaxies, the stars, the planets, etc. So he knows the power, the authority, and the jurisdiction of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala more than anyone. So if he is a believer, he would be more fearing Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala than anyone else. So in that sense, I agree that everything, and then, like linguistics and language, for example, literature, generally all those knowledge, all those fields of social sciences, etc., they are studied by people, and mostly they would have a godless concept of the universe, etc. So if a believer is studying that, of course he would be mindful of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and his iman would be increases. Dr. Jamaluddin, I'm not sure, but I have just tried to comment on that. Thank you very much.
Jazakumullah khair, Dr. Jamaluddin. I'm also a computer scientist, and if you want to discuss this topic further, we can have a discussion separately as well. Jazakumullah khair, everybody. Thank you for participating. Thank you, Dr. Ziaullah Rehmani, for such a wonderful session today. And we have come to the end of today's session. Inshallah, we'll be back with another interesting lecture next month. Stay tuned, and Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.